I found the book very interesting. It's a very impressive study based on a real insight and a real ability to recreate research material into the language of everyday life. And it gives us confidence about the ability of sociology to actually illuminate everyday public experience. What I'm really interested in doing is to talk about what I think are the cultural underpinnings of many of the issues raised by Mark in his book, and also some ideas that I've been working with that run parallel to what he's really talking about. Because I think that one of the key questions that we're confronted with, we never actually talk about it, is how does the world, how does society deal with the question of uncertainty? And to what extent can we manage it? To what extent can we make it work for us? See, if we're not able to deal with uncertainty in any kind of meaningful sense, then it's very difficult to provide a signpost for our young people into the future. If we ourselves are not sure about the meaning of our lives, then it becomes very difficult for us to give young people a vision of the future, never mind the adult population. And one of the real problems that we're confronted with, and it really comes out in this idea of declinism, is that we're living in a world where fatalism, a fatalistic cultural moment, has acquired a very unique, intense character, where if you look at European history, since the Renaissance, when they had the big discussions about Fortuna and about the future, I don't think there's ever been a moment when society, not the individuals, but society, had this very diminished sense of human control over the resolution of our problems. Every time I go to a meeting of politicians or think tanks, they always produce a report. And the report always begins with the same two lines. We live in an ever-changing world. Change has never been as fast as it is now. It's constantly accelerating. And I always get the impression that you got this one person in Paris, and he writes all these reports that tell us how the world is changing. You would almost imagine that the world has never changed before. And it's only in our times that we're confronted with these problems. And the upshot of the argument that we live in an ever-changing world, and they kind of spell this out, particularly in the OECD, is that the knowledge of the past, what you learned when you were young, is useless today. And we tell this to our children. What's the point in learning Greek or Latin or classics? Because this is the old stuff that's not going to help you to make sense of the world tomorrow. And as we get into this idea that the knowledge of the past is of no moment to the present, so society becomes increasingly decoupled from the past. It loses all of its bearing, its links with the past. And I think that's one of the really important developments that we're seeing today. I think in many respects, my equivalent concept of declinism is this strong sense of presentism that we live in. It's a very interesting moment in our adventurous human beings, because what presentism is on the one hand, we're estranged from the past, we don't particularly feel comfortable with it, and at the same time, we fear the future. The future is a very negative, destructive territory. And it's interesting that in the 21st century, there aren't any future-oriented ideologies, there aren't any future-oriented philosophies that kind of capture people's imagination. Something that, in many respects, is quite remarkable. But what's interesting about our declinism, because there's been moments in history where there has been a sense of decline, is that in the past, declinism had an image of the good old days, of the golden age. I mean, that's really the classical Christian, fall from the grace, the sense that in the past, things were really beautiful and wonderful, but we just lost our way, and we got to get back to it. Certainly in the Anglo-American world, the phrase, the good old days, the golden age, has gone out of usage. In fact, our Prime Minister, David Cameron, often talks about the bad old days. In the bad old days when we were all racist, when we were all homophobic, in the bad old days when we were nationalist and chauvinist. Somehow there is this irredeemable quality of things in the past that we just might as well give up on. It's not really important. And of course, if that is the case, if things really are as bad as all that, then we've got a big problem with young people. And the big problem that we got with young people is this, is if you have a generation of parents or adults, teachers, professors, who actually believe that they haven't got any values to transmit to the young, in other words, where they actually believe that there is really nothing of moral content that they can socialize the younger generations with, then what's going to happen? And this is the big hidden question that we've been grappling with for some time. Of course, what happens is that teachers and parents do not attempt to socialize young people with the legacy of the past. They feel very uncomfortable with passing that on, and school curriculums very much try to avoid that. And they replace it with what I suppose, for lack of a better word, Habermas used to call administrative values. Values that are kind of created in committees by the EU in Brussels. They sit around and, we're going to have to write a values statement. I don't know if you read these values statements. It's usually about European values, and you desperately look for what these values are. And it's always the same thing, diversity, which is not a value, that's a description. Diversity means there's many. That's all there, and it can give you a little long list. And at the end of the day, you realize that these are not values that are particularly going to inspire young people. And in fact, the one value that they try to really promote everywhere in Europe is non-judgmentalism. I don't know about Belgium, whether you teach non-judgmentalism, about how good it is. But as you know, non-judgmentalism, where I come from, means refusing to discriminate, refusing to make judgments of value. As Hannah Arendt once said, if you don't make judgments, then you don't take the other person seriously. It means we haven't got a conversation, we haven't got a debate, we haven't got a discussion. And of course, what non-judgmentalism also does is it detaches young people from the older generation. Because if there aren't any good values that you can judge to be good, then what do your parents or your teachers have got to say for you? And I think that kind of cultural climate creates a situation where we end up socializing our young people into the values of low expectations. And one of the things I'm concerned with, I think it's the key question facing the future of our continent, is young people today are socialized in a way to be childish. We tell them in school, oh, if you fail, it's not the end of the world. Oh, it's not that really that important that you do, well in school. Oh, there's no point taking those risks. I mean, just last week, we had the first school in England that banned the blowing of a whistle in a football match in case it traumatizes the children. They describe it as being exceedingly violent. We had a situation where a panic broke out 2 weeks ago because of the SATs exams that 9-year-old children were, were doing. And the idea was that this was too stressful. We have an expression called exam stress now that we use as a medical description. And what we're doing is continually questioning and undermining the resilience of generations that are coming. And although the young people have the same values as old people, and in that sense there isn't a huge difference, the one big change that has occurred is we're infantilizing a significant section of the young people of our society. We're encouraging them to become dependent rather than independent. We're not educating them for independence. And I think that's in many respects the source of the fatalism, the fear that there's nothing you can do when you begin to strengthen the passive side of young people rather than their active side. I actually think the key question that confronts us today, that underpins all of our political discussion, is what I would call a diminished sense of agency, a diminished sense of subjectivity that is part and parcel of our cultural script, where we lower the bar of what we expect people to do, where we don't actually think that our job in this world as human beings is to transform it, where we think that we're the subjects of history, but instead regard ourselves as the objects. And I think that cultural message is communicated all the time in a variety of different ways. And it's something that, in a sense, becomes very much part of the world that we're kind of living. So that low expectation of the future, actually means that we continually interpret. Am I making somebody nervous? Sort of. Oh, right. Somebody, maybe it's God giving me a hint. That we continually sort of get to the point where, because of low expectations, we're not really getting people to kind of grapple and struggle with the kind of problems ahead that we're dealing with. One of the interesting things that you find within generations today is that increasingly our generations, the younger generations, are becoming increasingly segmented. We find that instead of having a national conversation, we're having a community-wide conversation, they become very much enclosed upon themselves within the generations, where they talk to people who are pretty much like themselves, where there are different pools of individuals all talking to each other and all finding it very difficult to find some way of transcending and overcoming these issues. And as a result of that, the way that people lead their lives among the younger generations is that their identity becomes increasingly enhanced and is increasingly seen as becoming significant. And the lifestyle choices you make, your identity, becomes critically important. So that, for example, when I go to a meeting in America or in Britain, a university meeting where there's student activists, they will get up like this and they will say, as a young African, I have to say this. The next person gets up as a young Muslim student or as a first generation Jewish immigrant, I'm going to say this. They identify themselves in terms of their ethnic and cultural affiliations. And in that sense, sort of create a condition where within themselves, they become increasingly divided and increasingly fragmented. And that sense of cultural turn that has occurred is very much an issue for us today. Finally, I think that the key task, the key issue that we got to deal with is to recognize that there is no political solution to the issues raised in Mark's book. And I say that not because I'm pessimistic, but because I actually believe that before we can address the big political questions, we have to begin more modestly in the pre-political sphere. I think it's in the domain of pre-political life, of family life, of community life, of socialization, of education, that a lot of the essentially fundamental battles need to be fought. One of the key issues that faces us in the pre-political sphere is to answer the question, how do we define the meaning of personhood in the 21st century? What does it mean to be a person? You know, the question of personhood is vitally important because it raises questions about what we expect of you. How much risks do you think you should be able to take? How much struggle can we expect of you as an individual? What does it mean for a person to deal with the obstacles that are thrown up in front of our experiences? And these are the kind of questions that we need to be able to resolve if we are going to sort of deal with this. People in this room who are intellectuals can play a role in this. And I think the principal role that intellectuals can play is to assist the restoration of historical memory. I think that historical consciousness, the sense of change, and therefore the understanding that it's always possible, there's no such thing as a hopeless situation, is something that we learn from history. And I think for young people, the key lesson to learn that we can teach them, especially of the older generations, is that old story by Kafka. You know, Kafka tells the story where this guy waits in front of the door to be let in, and he's waiting and waiting to be let in for years and years and years, and he's getting white hair. He's not really getting anywhere. And then just as he's about to die, having waited so long, somebody says, the door was open all the time. Thank you.